Brian stood in the cramped kitchen of his Texas home, 14 and nervous, his hands twisting the hem of his shirt as he faced his mother. "Mom, I'm gay," he blurted, voice cracking, his heart pounding so loud he barely heard her gasp. She froze, eyes wide, a plate slipping from her hands to shatter on the tile, then crumpled, her body hitting the floor with a thud that echoed in his skull. Brian lunged forward. "Mom!" he cried, shaking her shoulders, panic clawing at him as her face paled, her breath shallow. The ambulance lights flashed through the window soon after, neighbors peering from porches, his world tilting as paramedics rushed her out, stretcher wheels rattling on the gravel. At the hospital, machines beeped, her blood pressure spiking, a doctor muttering about stress, and Brian sat, small and trembling, guilt sinking deep into his bones. She woke the next day, tubes snaking from her arms, her voice frail but sharp. "Brian, you can't tell your dad. Promise me." Her eyes locked on his, wild with fear. "He'll never handle it. It'll kill him." Brian nodded, throat tight. "I promise," he whispered, the words heavy, a chain snapping shut around his chest. She gripped his hand, her fingers cold. "Keep it quiet for me," she pressed. Her plea, a weight he couldn't shake. A vow born from her collapse that pinned him to a life he hadn't chosen. He saw her fragility, the way her lips quivered, the monitor's erratic spikes, and felt the blame settle, a stone in his gut. He'd wanted to be free, to breathe his truth, but her fall turned that hope to ash, locking him in a pact he didn't understand. They returned home, the kitchen floor still speckled with shards, a silent witness to the moment that split his life in two. Brian swept it up, hands shaking, each clink of glass a reminder of her faint, her fear, the promise now ruling him. His mother moved slower, her gaze darting to him, checking for cracks in his mask. "You're a good boy," she'd say, voice soft but edged, a reassurance that felt more like a command. He'd nod, forcing a smile, the kitchen a battlefield where he'd lost his voice, his truth buried under her plea. His dad stayed oblivious, grunting over coffee, the house humming with its usual rhythm, but Brian felt the shift, a quiet terror creeping in, knowing one slip could unravel it all. He'd lie awake that night, replaying her collapse, the ambulance's wail, her desperate eyes, the promise echoing like a drum in his ears. He was 14, too young to carry this, but old enough to feel its weight. A secret he'd guard not for himself, but for her. The walls seemed closer, the air thicker, his truth a ghost he'd locked away, haunting him in the stillness. He didn't know how long he could hold it, didn't know what it had cost, but her fall had branded him, a boy tethered to a vow he'd never wanted to make. That kitchen shock was Brian's first fracture, a truth spoken and swiftly silenced, a promise that caged him tight. His mother's fear became his, her collapse his burden, setting him on a path of masks he couldn't yet see the end of. If Brian's silence cuts close, stick with us. Hit that like, share this with someone who's carried a secret, and subscribe to Heartstories. Tap that bell for more raw tales of struggle. Brian molded himself into the son his mother needed, a flawless facade crafted to honor the vow he'd made in that sterile hospital room. At 15, then 16, he threw himself into schoolwork in their dusty Texas town, his report cards a parade of A's, a gleaming armor he polished daily. Sundays found him in the wooden pews of their church, hands clasped, eyes down, mouthing prayers that tasted like ash. The preacher's sermons a distant drone against the chaos churning inside him. His classmates swirled around him, alive with the buzz of first loves, swapping tales of awkward dates under the bleachers, their giddy laughter a sharp edge he sidestepped with a casual, "I don't care about that stuff." His voice hollow, his gaze fixed on the floor, each lie stacking another layer onto the wall he'd built to keep his truth buried. He wasn't the Brian who'd once dreamed of being known. He was the dutiful boy, the studious shadow, a role he played to shield her fragile peace. Love brushed against him, tentative and dangerous, but he turned it away, a habit forged in the fire of her fear. Sarah, a girl with soft brown curls, lingered after algebra, her fingers brushing his as she handed him a folded note. "You're different, Brian, I like that," she'd said, her smile timid, hopeful. He'd frozen, heart thudding, then shoved it in his pocket. "I'm too busy," he'd muttered, walking off, her confused stare a weight he felt all day. Alone in his room, he pulled it out, her words a whisper of what could be, then tore it to bits, the scraps drifting down like snow. His breath ragged, a pang twisting deep in his chest. Boys were worse, their glances a risk he couldn't take. Eli, a lanky kid with a crooked grin, slipped him a letter between classes. "I think about you, meet me after practice," it read. Simple, raw. Brian's hands trembled as he held it, a flush creeping up his neck, then ripped it apart in the bathroom. The sound bouncing off the cold walls, his knees buckling as he slid down, sobs breaking free, the mirror reflecting a boy he'd locked away. He'd splash water on his face, rub the redness from his eyes, force the mask back on, but the cracks stayed, jagged lines he hid with every step. Nights pressed in, his bedroom a tomb where he'd sit, curtains drawn, the hum of cicadas outside a chorus he couldn't join. His friends gathered at the diner, voices loud with tales of stolen kisses, prom plans, their freedom a world he watched from afar, radio static, his shield against their joy. Sarah tried once more, her tone gentle by the lockers. "You never let anyone in, why?" He'd shrugged, just not into it. The grin he flashed bitter, rehearsed, her sigh a burden he carried home in silence. Eli stopped looking his way, his absence a quiet wound, a loss Brian mourned alone. Shoving it down with algebra proofs and church hymns he recited without heart. Church was a theater, his mother's gaze a spotlight from the row ahead, her nod a silent tally. "You're my good boy," she'd say after, her hand light on his arm, a leash he couldn't break. He'd force a smile, lips dry, the congregation's murmurs a fog he waded through, their lives a script he followed blindly. He'd stare at the cross, wood-worn smooth, wondering what he'd say if he could speak, who he'd be without her expectations. School mirrored it, his teachers beaming, a model student, their praise ringing empty, not reaching the boy who'd sat up late, shredding notes that dared to see him, who'd washed away tears in a sink that knew his secrets. His classmates swapped gossip at lunch. "Who are you asking out?" they'd tease, and he'd laugh, "No one, I've got tests." The dodge smooth, practiced, his isolation a cloak he wore too well. Brian lived trapped by those unseen walls, each day a deeper plunge into a role he'd mastered. He'd sit at the kitchen table, fork scraping, his mother's chatter about college plans a one-sided song, his own voice lost to the performance. He wasn't alive, he was an actor. A son she could stomach, a lie she could hold. The tears he'd shed dried up, but the hollow stayed, a ache gnawing at his ribs, a yearning he smothered with every forced nod. He didn't know when it'd break, didn't know how much more he could give, but he kept it up for her, a boy bound by a promise that kept him whole and shattered all at once. Brian lived in the shadow of his father, a man whose presence filled their Texas home with a chill that words could never thaw. He was a figure of iron, broad and unyielding, his face carved with deep lines from decades at the factory, his voice a rare rumble over breakfast. "Pass the salt," or a gruff command to fix the fence. He never wrapped an arm around Brian, never asked about his dreams, his eyes locked on the flickering TV at supper, forks scraping against chipped plates, the news a barrier between them. Brian studied him, a boy yearning for a flicker of connection, a smile, a question, but met only a wall, cold and tall, a distance that stretched back as far as he could recall. At 17, his father looked up from a grease-stained paper, brows knit. "No girlfriend yet, son?" Brian's heart lurched, his throat dry. "I'm just focusing on school, Dad," he'd said, forcing a grin, his hands clenching under the table, the lie a shield he'd polished for years. His father grunted, a single nod, then turned away, leaving Brian to stew in the quiet, wondering what those gray eyes would do if they saw the real him. That silence was a constant companion, a void Brian navigated through his final years at home. He'd pass his father in the narrow hall, their shoulders brushing, a curt dip of the head their only greeting, the air thick with what wasn't said. He'd hear him in the garage, the clank of a wrench, the twang of country songs spilling from a tinny radio, a space Brian hovered near but never entered. He'd sit on his bed, books splayed open, ears tuned to those sounds, picturing a moment. Dad, I'm different. But the thought withered, choked by the promise he'd made his mother, a vow that sealed his lips tight. He'd watch his father at the table, chewing slow, jaw set, and feel the dread coil tighter, a fear that this man's sternness would harden to hate if the truth broke free. They were strangers under one roof, tied by blood but split by an abyss, a house where affection was a ghost, where I love you was a phrase Brian had never heard from those lips. Harvard came like a lifeline at 18, a chance to flee the weight of that silence, a train ticket clutched as he left Texas behind. His father's farewell was a firm grip, knuckles rough. Do good up there, he'd said, voice flat, no trace of pride, no lingering look. The campus unfurled before Brian, ivy climbing red brick, autumn leaves crunching underfoot, a hum of life that felt foreign, alive. He dove into his studies, psychology books stacked high on his desk, pages filled with theories he devoured. A quest to unravel the knots in his own head. Friends circled him, their voices bright in the dorm's common room, swapping stories of weekend flings, their ease a rhythm he couldn't find. He'd sit among them, nodding at their tales, she's great or he's a catch, but kept his distance, his own story a locked vault, the promise a whisper that held him back, a chain he dragged across state lines. One night pushed him to the edge, a party in a cluttered apartment, bass pulsing through the walls, empty cups scattered on tables. Sam, a classmate with dark hair and a quick laugh, leaned in, his shoulder brushing Brian's. You're always so guarded. What's up with you? He'd asked, voice teasing, eyes warm. Before Brian could answer, Sam's lips met his, a brief electric touch, a jolt that woke something buried deep. He stiffened, then pulled away. I can't do this, he choked out, shoving through the crowd, the night air biting as he fled to his room. He collapsed on his bed, breath ragged, Sam's kiss lingering like a burn, the promise roaring in his skull, a voice he couldn't silence, a plea that drowned the want he'd felt. He'd craved it, that moment, that glimpse of himself, but the fear won, a wall he couldn't climb, built from a vow he'd carried too long. Brian roamed Harvard's paths, a student in name, a captive in spirit. He'd scribble notes in class, tracing the roots of shame, his own a puzzle he left unsolved. His father's silence echoed in his mind, a question he couldn't ask. Would you turn away? While his mother's words bound him, a promise that kept him from the life he glimpsed in others. He'd see students on the lawn, arms linked, laughing free, and feel a stab, a longing he buried under stacks of books. He'd escaped his father's cold gaze, but not its shadow, not her grip, a boy teetering between a chance to be and a duty to hide, his flame dim, waiting. Brian traded Harvard's quiet corridors for Hollywood's blinding glare at 22. His psychology books swapped for scripts, a leap into acting he hoped would let him breathe beyond the masks he'd worn. He arrived in Los Angeles with a battered suitcase, settling into a dingy apartment, walls stained yellow, the roar of cars outside a restless heartbeat. He plunged into auditions, pacing sweaty waiting rooms, directors squinting at him as more grit, less polish, their voices clipped, their stares peeling him apart. He landed small roles, a thief in a crime flick, a soldier in a war scene, his face flashing on screens, a flicker he barely recognized. But the feedback cut deep, a casting agent barking, "You're too gentle, not enough, man." His tone a whip that lashed at Brian's core. He'd nod, "I'll fix it," swallowing the sting, the words an echo of a self he'd long suppressed, a wound he nursed in silence. Hollywood stretched him thin, demanding a toughness he couldn't muster. A game of pretense that mirrored his past but offered no escape. He'd stand under hot lights, cameras humming, playing gruff loners or stoic heroes, roles that drained him dry. A break came with a film beside Mel Gibson, a titan whose name drew crowds, his rugged drawl commanding every take. Offset, though, Gibson's edge turned sharp, a slur flung at Brian over coffee. "Act like a man, not a pansy." His laugh rough, casual, the crew snickering along. Brian's gut twisted, his fists balling, but he stayed mute, eyes on the ground, the insult a brand he couldn't scrub off. He'd trudge back to his spot, jaw locked, the mask he'd crafted for his mother now a costume for this brutal stage, a shield he wore to survive, his silence a surrender he loathed but couldn't break. Home visits deepened the rift. Trips to Texas a stark contrast to LA's chaos, yet no less isolating. His mother met him at the porch, her apron dusted with flour. "How's the acting?" she'd ask, her smile tight, her focus narrowing to his jobs. "Caught you in that cop show, so proud." He'd force a grin. "It's going well?" His voice flat, the dining room a theater for their careful exchange. She'd serve him meatloaf, prattle about his scenes. "They love your intensity," her hands fluttering, her questions stopping at his work, never brushing the edges of his life. He'd sit, fork in hand, waiting for her to ask, "Anyone special?" But the words never came, her silence a fortress around his heart. He'd watch her clear plates, her back to him, and feel the distance stretch, a son she praised but didn't see, a love she wouldn't name, a void he couldn't fill with lines or accolades. Back in Hollywood, the loneliness took root, a quiet rot spreading through his days. He'd slump in his trailer, script pages curling at the edges, his eyes tracing words that felt foreign, roles that spoke louder than he ever could. He'd wander the streets, past flashing billboards and chattering crowds, a ghost in a city that never slept, his footsteps lost in the din. Co-stars called out, "Join us at the bar." Their voices warm, but he'd shrug, got lines to run, the excuse a wall he hid behind, his nights spent alone staring at a ceiling stained with watermarks. He'd replay Gibson's Barb, his mother's Dodge, the characters he played, each a thread unraveling the boy he'd been. He'd pace his tiny room, the city's pulse a distant thrum, wondering who he'd become when the camera stopped, a question that gnawed at him in the stillness. Brian's life in Hollywood was a parade of masks, each role a further drift from himself. He'd stand before his mirror, rehearsing scowls, his reflection a hollow shell, eyes shadowed with a fatigue he couldn't shake. His mother's calls punctuated the weeks. "What's next on set?" Her tone chipper, tethered to a version of him she could bear, never digging past the surface, never asking what lay beneath. He'd reply, "Another film, Mom." His words rote, their talks a ritual of avoidance, a dance around a truth she'd never face. The slurs, the dismissals, the quiet at home, they stacked up, a burden bowing his shoulders, his identity a whisper drowned in the roar of applause. He wasn't thriving, he was fading. A man whose days were performances, his soul a flicker lost in the roles, a life slipping through his fingers with every take. Brian stepped back into his childhood home at 30, summoned by his father's sudden passing, the air thick with the scent of old tobacco and stillness. The Texas house stood frozen in time, its worn furniture a silent archive of a life he'd never pierced. He wandered to the bedroom, a space his father had kept locked in life, and slid open a drawer, expecting tax forms or rusted tools. Instead, he found a bundle of photographs, edges frayed, showing men in faded jackets, their smiles tender, arms slung around each other in a way his father never had with him. Beneath them, a stash of magazines, bold with images from the 70s, a hidden world of longing tucked beneath a life of stern nods. Brian's breath caught, fingers trembling as he pieced it together. His father had lived a secret too, a parallel to the son who'd spent decades mute, both cloaked in fear of the other's judgment. He sank onto the mattress, dust rising, the photos spread before him like a confession he'd never heard. Had his father guessed? Had he seen the signs Brian fought to hide? The man who'd sat rigid at the table, who'd asked about girls with a grunt, had he wrestled the same shadows, stifling his own truth to fit a world that wouldn't bend? Brian's voice broke the quiet. "I thought you'd hate me," he murmured, "but you were hiding too." The realization stung, a bittersweet ache. Two souls bound by blood, yet severed by silence, each guarding a heart the other might have held, a tragedy of missed chances etched in those fragile prints. He clutched them, tears blurring the faces, a grief for what they'd lost, a father and son who'd mirrored each other's cages without knowing. 3 years later, in 2023, his mother faded in a sterile ward, her final breath a sigh, her last words praising his screen work. "You're my star." No whisper of the life he'd cloaked. Her death snapped the vow he'd carried since 14, a weight lifting, leaving him bare but alive. He stood by her plot, rain streaking his face, and chose himself, coming out on a small radio show. "I'm gay, and I'm not acting anymore," his tone firm, a freedom he'd earned through years of quiet. He shed Hollywood, its roles a shroud he'd outgrown, and turned to therapy, training in Austin to counsel those who'd worn masks like his, opening a room where LGBTQ+ voices could heal, a lifeline to the boy he'd once been, scared and unseen. Brian crafted a new existence, his office a haven of soft chairs and warm light, his hours spent with clients who'd known the same dread, their stories threading into his own. He kept his father's photos on a shelf, a quiet tribute, a bridge to a man he'd never truly met, a reminder of the cost of fear. He'd pause, tracing their outlines, feeling the pang of what might have been, a bond unclaimed, a love unspoken. At a local event, he took the mic. "I played parts for them, for me until I couldn't," he said, voice steady. "Now I'm Brian, no script, just me, and that's all I need." The crowd clapped, a sound of recognition, his win a beacon for those still fighting, a testament to breaking free from a legacy of silence. He walked home under a wide sky, the city's hum a backdrop to his peace, his stride sure, his spirit his own. The mask had fallen, the promise faded, his father's secret a lesson, his mother's hold a memory he'd outlasted. He was whole, not just from their loss, but from the years he'd given to their fears, a man who'd claimed his truth at last. When did you shed your mask? Share below. If Brian's stand stirs you, hit that like, share it with someone who's broken free, and subscribe to Heartstories. We're here for the bold. Join us, tap that bell,